things, as you saw yesterday, and what Jason was talking about, this is better off as a think about as a discussion, okay? Because there's nothing that's right or nothing that's wrong. The only thing that's wrong are the questions not asked. They're the wrong questions, the one that's not asked. Okay? So, I'm not a terribly religious person, but I think there is something above all this mess that we're into. And this is a quote from one of my anatomy professors in veterinary school. If you consider the hoof of the horse, then I must believe in God. That was her thing. Because sometimes you don't think about that piece of equipment that you work on. You can go ahead, those structures, the horse can have 1,000 pounds over top of it. It can go over a 4-foot fence, come over the other side, the foot lands on the ground and it doesn't explode. Pretty amazing when you think about it. So what we want to do here is just rapid fire. We're going to go through the structures of the foot, okay? And there's a lot of points about it I want to bring out, okay? This is what Mark and I were talking about yesterday. Einstein's one of my favorites when it comes to quotes, you know? And it's not the learning of facts. It's thinking your way through these facts and how to apply it. It's the whole thing is a thought process, okay? And whatever you take home, I hope from Mark and a little bit that I add or whatever, when you go home, you're going to think about what you do just a little bit more when you approach that horse, okay? My practice, not only because I'm a veterinarian, but I try and look at evidence-based, that which we have proof for or some credibility, and the information in the literature on the application of farrier is really sparse. Okay, and that's why it's a really, it's a pleasure to see so many people come out to the clinic and listen to some of these things. Okay. If you think about evidence-based farrier, one of the things that you can think about is the anatomy. That's factual. You can think about biomechanics from Newton on down. That's factual. And then good basic farrier principles. And I don't know, I guess it's in the next presentation, you'll see a whole list of authors from 1897 on down, okay, that really taught good basic farrier back before the turn of the century. Something happened in between here. Okay? One thing I want to just, and believe me, this is an informational website only because I don't want any more work. I'm too old. I did my thing. Okay? But we have about 80 some peer-reviewed papers on there. There's a blog. There's a lot of information where vets or farriers can go send their client to this website and you can get some good, credible information. Things that have some proof to it. Okay? So, form, and this is the structures of the foot, okay? Determine their function. And what I'm going to try and show out. And underneath here is Dr. Andy Parks, one of my mentors. And all these pretty slides you're going to see under here are taken from the glass horse that he built, quite a few years ago. Okay, so the structures of the hoof, when healthy, have this inherent ability to absorb concussion and dissipate the energy of impact. And there's so many parts of the horse's hoof that have this ability. So when you see these structures, they're going to be marked with this little sunshine here. And I think it's going to bring out a little bit more information on the horse's foot. So if we think about the digit, okay, the digit is that area from the fetlock down to the ground. If we call the foot, or we define the foot, that's the distal end of the middle phalanx, okay, and the structures down to the ground, that which is in purple, which you all know. So let's look at the digit, okay? The proximal, the middle, and the distal phalanx. The proximal and the middle phalanx, these are elliptical cylinders. They're curved in the front, and they're flattening in the palmar plantar section to accommodate those ligaments and tendons, etc. The P1 and P2, they articulate with a bone up below and above. If you think about the distal phalanx, this only articulates with one bone above there. The other one's on the ground. It's kind of a unique bone because it has no cortex, it has no medullary, or it has a porous cortex. It has no medullary cavity, and it's completely covered in soft tissue. So if we look at this bone, okay, it has 3 surfaces, it has 3 borders, okay. Now, being porous with no cortex, it's very prone to remodeling. And as you can see here, I don't know if you can see here, this is what you so-called pedal osteitis. Here you can see a little marginal fracture, whatever, okay? These 2 entities come from either lack of protection, in other words, you don't have enough sole depth or thickness, or overload. This is the chronic labyrinthic course. You can see all the lobe of the toe. You can see that bone is completely changed shape on there. Pretty amazing. And again, this is one. And pedal osteitis, people talk about it as a disease and whatever. Pedal osteitis is no more than a radiographic diagnosis. Okay? That you have either overloaded or have not protected that bone within the hoof capsule. So there's that little shovel-shaped bone that causes all these problems. Excuse me. It has an articular surface, it has a flexor surface, it has 2 wings. But look at this poor blood supply underneath here. You wonder why you have so many problems here. But what it can do is we can go ahead, we can stick it in there, it makes that a usable joint, and we can divide the foot into dorsal and palmar, or dorsal and plantar, being the hind foot. Okay, now, Mark talked about this a little bit. See where that red arrow is? This is the articular surface of the distal phalanx, or the coffin bone. That little area right there, that's where the navicular bone articulates with P3. And when we think about that, the navicular bone is actually held in place by the suspensory ligaments to the navicular bone, and here's the impar ligament. So I want you to start thinking about the navicular bone and the distal phalanx. These move as one, and they articulate against the middle phalanx. So it makes a little bit more sense that when we're talking about the center of articulation there, because it's not as complex. In other words, it's actually 2 bones you're dealing with rather than 3 bones. Okay? You want to put a little proof to it. Okay? Here's a radiograph, lateral radiograph. This is with the horse, his foot planted straight on the ground. Okay? Now, pick up the bone, or pick up the limb and flex it. You see how very little the navicular bone or distal sesamoid bone changes. It stays in place. So it gives you good credibility that it moves as one. Now, if we look at the fetlock, here's your proximal sesamoid bone. Here's the horse bearing weight. Now we go ahead and flex that. Look at how that proximal sesamoid bone, look at how it changes position. Okay. Everybody follow me so far? Mm-hmm. Good. You know, if you don't understand something, please question, and if I can't answer, damn sure Mark can. So. Right. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see it for me.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. Okay. Okay. So let's look at the palmar plantar surface. This cartilaginous cartilage here on the palmar surface of the middle phalanx. This is called a scudum. Okay? And this is the proximal scudum. And then we take the navicular bone, which we're talking about, and this is the distal scudum here. Okay, you say, well, so what's a big deal? So if we take these 2 scudums, okay, this is where the deep flexor tendon rides over, okay, and you'll see how the deep flexor tendon forms how the tendon inserts on the distal phalanx. Okay, so it gives you it's like your grinder. It keeps a constant level of insertion there. Okay, so think about what happens when you go ahead and you trim those heels. When the heels become high or low, you change this angle of insertion here. Now, here's the first one you see here. Here is beautiful slide. Look at the wide expanse of the deep flexor tendon there. This is the support system in the back of the distal phalanx. Okay, cut that tendon, what happens? The toe of the foot goes up in the air. Okay, so when the horse lands, and all this is again, when the horse is healthy, when the foot's healthy, then the bone goes, the joint, the coffin joint moves in a distal palmar direction into this sling. So if you have compromised heels or heel structures in the palmar section of the horse's foot, you lose that first shock absorbing mechanism in the horse's foot. Okay? Bear that in mind. Okay? Here's a picture. Here's a broken back hoof pastern axis, and this is the so-called negative palmar angle. If you take P1 here and you draw an arrow in P1, P1 is always going to give you the direction of the load. Start looking at x-rays and you'll see that. Foolproof, okay? So right away, now you'll see that the palmar section of the bone joint has descended. Look at the difference, or look at the pressure, the angle of insertion of the deep flexor tendon. Look at how it's changed the forces on the bone. This is how important, you know, the palmar section of the horse's foot is. Okay? So now we have the osseous structures to accept weight. Now we need to go ahead and put some soft tissue structures in there to absorb concussion, dissipate the energy of impact, however you want to go ahead and address that. Okay? And basically what we're talking about here is the umbilical cartilages, the distal, the digital cushion, and the frog, the epidermal frog. Okay? Here again, here's one of your shock absorbing centers. If we look at these rhomboid sections of cartilage, they are, half of it is in the hoof capsule and half of it is above the hoof capsule. But look right away, you can see that this forms an extension of the distal phalanx. In other words, this fills out your hoof capsule and gives you more length there. If we look at from the palmar view, you'll see these have these little axial projections on here. And when the horse's foot is healthy, it is thought now to be, when the horse loads his foot, these tabs are going to land on the bars and help you with a little bit of motion of the hoof capsule. So they stabilize the palmar foot, they aid in lateral extension, expansion of the hoof capsule, okay? They equalize pressure within the hoof, and they decrease concussion, along with the other soft tissue deformable structures in the back of the foot. Okay? The digital cushion. This is what shapes the palmar or plantar section of the horse's foot. If you don't have a good digital cushion, you don't have good conformation to that horse's foot. Okay? Again, when it's healthy, it's one of your shock absorbing parts. Okay? We've got hit 3 of them so far. When we think about this, it's composed of fat cells, fibers trabeculae, elastic fibers, and some of the really good healthy foot, you got a lot of fibrocartilage in there. But, okay, all these cells that make up the digital cushion are very slow dividing cells. And then it's got a poor blood supply. So if you've got slow dividing cells plus a poor blood supply, what does it mean? It does not, restore. It doesn't have the ability to restore. So if you lose it, you lose it. So it's all about prevention. And you guys have so much influence on the back of the horse's foot. In other words, this section. Here's a slide. I think I might have hooked this one from Mark. Again, if you look at the digital cushion and the epidermal frog, you like to have a good inch there if you can. I mean, that's really pushing it, but you like to have a good inch. Now, if you put your thumb above the bolt of the heels and you put your finger at the base of the frog, the closer your finger and thumb come together is how much mass you have in the back of that horse's foot. You like to have that, but when you get to that, you got a big problem. You're not going to restore it, you're going to try and maintain it. Okay? You recognize that picture on the left, Mark? Mm-hmm. It should have your name on. I apologize.
That's all right.
No, I apologize because, I'm a fundy on that. Okay? I consider this one a good foot. Now look at this one over on the right side here. Okay? You've lost the digital cushion. Look at the difference in the conformation. Okay? You can maintain, you can even make this foot better and maintain it, but now this one's in the maintenance mode. You got to figure out how to maintain that foot without the structures in the palmar or plantar section. Am I talking too fast for you guys?
No.
You sure? Everybody follow me? Okay. Okay. We need ligaments. Ligaments, remember, we don't have any muscle down from the carpus on down to the ground. So we need something to stabilize the joints. We need something to guide the joints, you know, as they move. What's concern to farrier, more times than not, is the collateral ligament to the distal phalanx here, between the middle and the distal phalanx, and the suspensory ligament to the vicar bone. So you think about these two ligaments, when that horse manipulates the ground and the different footing there, these two come into play. How you deal with the horse's foot is going to affect how that horse's foot lands, as it was discussed yesterday. Okay, tendons. Something was quite interesting yesterday that Mark talked about. He talked about, you know, when the horse's foot lands during the stance phase, then the inertia pushes the horse forward. Okay? Okay? Because if you go ahead and you take the extensor tendon there and you cut it in half there, that horse is going to drag his toe for a couple days. You might put a bandage on him, and after 10, 12 days, he's going to walk just like a normal horse. So I think that the extensor tendon is more of a supportive structure in front. Now, if you think about the deep flexor tendon, again, that is holding up the back of the horse's foot. It's determining your conformation, and if you lose that, if it shortens or lengthens, it's going to change the conformation in the back of your foot. Okay, the blood supply. This is a little bit tricky. You ever wonder why a horse, the majority of times with laminitis, they're going to go ahead and they're going to rotate? Okay? And one of the reasons is that you have a dual blood supply in the palmar section of the horse's foot, and you have a very poor supply in the dorsal section of the horse's foot. Something went wrong here in the factory. Because if we look at this, here's your dual blood supply, but now look at here's your circumflex artery. And remember, the circumflex artery can be under the margin of the bone, in front of the margin of the bone, or above the margin of the bone, depending on the conformation. But here you have the lamellae. They're being perfused from the circumflex artery dorsally, in other words, toward the top, and they're going halfway up against gravity. The proximal part of the lamellae are being transfused by the dorsal artery of their coronary vein artery, and that's going downward. So they kind of meet in the middle. And if we look at this a little further, here's a pretty normal venogram. Look at your coronary plexus, your plexus in the either side of the ungual cartilages. You can see here. Look at the nice perfusion of the circumflex artery. But look at the blood supply in the dorsal section of the horse's foot. Okay, and this is a pretty normal foot. Okay, look at remember this is venous circulation, but look at the difference in the blood supply there.
This an arteriogram right here?
A venogram.
This is a venogram.
Yeah. Yeah. Remember, venograms are venous.
Yeah.
You know, we're not looking at your articular. So this is all the venous circulation. But look at the difference in the circulation in the dorsal wall. One of the things that bothers me still, that I still read it in the Farrier's Journal in different places, is that the frog is the pump in other words, it's the heart underneath the foot, or it pumps blood. The frog has very little to do with it when you think about it. And Bill Moyer and myself, years ago, we took the frogs out of a dozen horses. And the only thing that happened to those horses were the heel started to become narrow because you didn't have that expansion joint. It made no difference at all. What really happens is that, and proven, is that the veins have no valves. So when the horse goes ahead and lifts his foot up, these veins fill with blood, venous blood now. And then when the horse puts weight on the ground, okay, the blood is forced out of there back toward the heart up. That's how the hemodynamic system of the foot works. But the interesting thing about it is this goes ahead and forms another one of your shock absorbing mechanisms, okay? Because if you look at these plexuses, again, if the horse's foot is healthy, you have a real big plexus on either side of the ungual cartilages, you have a coronary plexus, and if you have good sole depth or some thickness, you have a plexus underneath that sole. Okay? If you've lost that sole and you have just, your fingers will deform it, you don't have a plexus and you lost this particular mechanism. Okay. That's the hemodynamic system of the horse's foot. But again, as I started out with, the foot needs to be healthy. And this is where you guys come in. This is what you guys do every day. Okay? So, I like definitions. And if you define the hoof capsule, it's the wall, the sole, the frog, and the bowl. In other words, those structures that are epidermal. Okay? And here's one of Dr. Powell's beautiful slides. Here you can see the hoof is the integument, which means it's the skin of the foot. It's a continuation of the coronary band. And this just outlines the structure very good. Okay? But we can divide the hoof capsule or the structures within it. Epidermis, this is your outer covering. But in order to form the epidermis, you have to have dermis. Okay? That's the second part. And then the subcutaneous tissue, this is the area where the foot sort of sinks into, okay? And makes it a little bit more pliable there, if you want to use that word. So the coriums you have are the laminar corium, the solar corium, and the cuneate corium, meaning that corium that produces your digital cushion there. Okay, the hoof wall, let's divide that into three. Okay? You have the stratum externum. What is the stratum externum? That is that shiny part of the horse's foot that goes from the coronary band to the bottom. You take it off of your ass, it replaces within 10 to 12 hours and you're back home again. The bulk of the hoof wall is the stratum medium, and then you have the stratum internum. That is your epidermal lamellae. That's where your dermal lamellae attaches, your attachment to suspend the bone within the hoof capsule. Okay, interesting enough, let's go back to that 1 second, okay? It doesn't make any difference whether you have a dark foot, a light foot, a white foot, a green foot. The inner part of the stratum medium is going to be non-pigmented. This is where you get so-called white line disease. You do not get it at the sole wall junction or the white line. It happens right here. This is the softest part of the horse's foot, or the horse's heel. Interesting, if we think about the properties of the hoof wall, these tubules, they're arranged in 4 distinct zones based on density. Okay? You have a real thick density at the perimeter of the horse's foot, and this, as you go toward the inner part of the hoof wall, where it becomes more moisture content, it becomes lower. They're more diffused. So when you think about it, when the horse lands on the ground, okay, all 1,000 pounds, the energy is slowly changed and, so shall we say, softened as it goes from the hoof wall into the inner part of the horse's foot, and then basically goes through the lamellae and up onto the bone. Okay? So the other thing is the tubular zonation also acts as a crack absorbing mechanism. So if you've all seen it, you have these little cracks at the border of the hoof capsule, okay? And they go up maybe half an inch or so. And you ever wonder, why do they stop there instead of just going right on up the hoof capsule? Okay? Well, the zonation and another part, which I'll show you in a minute, play a big role here. Here's where your little crack's going to be. And as it travels through the inner part of the hoof wall toward the lamellae, okay, these tubal zonations become a lot more diffuse. It's a lot softer, so you start to push your crack off at right angles. And here's the crux. If we look at the hoof capsule, and it's more fracture resistant to the bone. And these horn tubules, and you still see pictures, well, they look like a shock absorber or whatever. These are like putting uprights in a piece of concrete, okay? They're there for stability, okay? The interesting thing is here, and for years we thought this intertubular horn, the area between the horn tubule, this is just sort of a benign kind of a filler. Well, we're wrong, because this is composed of the intertubular horn of keratin fibrils, okay? And they're in sort of different directions. But these fibrils, they are perpendicular to the horn tubules that are coming from the coronary band distally toward the ground, okay? So think about this arrangement here. How could you have some more stability in the hoof capsule than this? I'm a lucky guy so far because I haven't heard any noise from the big man over here. Okay. So
Is this where you was telling us yesterday how the hoof tubules
that's
did?
exactly what.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm tying
Like a
in.
lamina on a windscreen.
Yeah.
And it strengthens and it's perpendicular to its stress, but in different directions.
Yeah, and he just said it a little
Like a
differently,
spiral staircase.
and it just tied in. For me, it tied in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's why the hoof capsule it's amazing. When you, I mean, all these structures of the hoof are amazing. Okay.
Dr. Brady,
Yes.
I was looking at those things because where I come from,
Could you talk up just a little bit?
yes sir, where I come from, our horn tubules often get eaten when the hoof gets eaten by our microorganisms. You can see the tubules, but the cement seems to be gone. And I started wondering why is that, and what I did find out was the keratin cells are different in the tubular horn and the intertubular horn. So I think that's a little detail in the structure of it, that the cells themselves, while they're keratin cells, they're different types of keratin in the cell.
Yeah,
Different.
Yeah, I'd like to chat to you a little bit more about that, but I think also it's a difference from the bearing border of the hoof ball inwards as you go closer to the bone as well. I think there's a change in what you were saying there as well.
Yeah, they have different densities.
Cool. Look about the sole again. The sole, you know, and I still believe that it kind of mirrors the solar surface of the distal phalanx, you know, that cavity of the bone. And here's a nice, you know, body of the sole. Your two crura are here. But if you take this apart, and I think, you know, we have the same slide from yesterday. You don't have the same horn tubules. You don't have the same histology here in the sole that you do in the hoof wall, except right at the margin of the sole wall junction there. So we're going to look at this more of a protective agent or a protective structure rather than a weight-bearing structure. But it does have the ability to share some weight. And all these structures can share weight. That's one of the joys about the horse's foot. And one of the things to be said about barefoot horses. And again, when the horse is healthy, when you have 15 millimeters or more, and that's an arbitrary distance that somebody came up with, maybe Rick Redden or something, I forget who it was. But you know, when you have substantial hoof sole there, where you put hoof testers on that sole, and those hoof testers do not deform. In other words, your sole does not change shape. You got enough sole underneath there, and you should have a pretty good plexus. The plexus being your dermis. Here's what makes my world go around is the bars, okay? And at the heels of the wall, it's inflected at an acute angle and it runs forward. This is weight bearing underneath the horse's foot, okay? Leave your knife in your pocket, okay? Don't take these out. They're weight bearing structures. They add additional strength to the heel, and this is what controls the lateral movement. You take a nice horse with a nice heel, lift up the other leg and watch the heels move. Take a horse that has a very low heel or a broken back angle there and lift the other foot up, and you see that heel go, heels go. So it controls the lateral movement there as well. Again, this is one of Dr. Pollitt's slides. And this, if you go ahead and you look at this and you take those bars out, what's underneath those bars? The melee. That means, in my mind, it's a weight-bearing structure. Okay? So this is bearing weight in the palmar section of the horse's foot. Leave them alone. Yes, sir.
But when I used to compete a long time ago, Derek competed back in the same era that I did. That if you was competing underneath the English judges, they always wanted you to sculpt around them bars. If you was,
No.
they didn't make you.
Did we start?
You were not allowed to scoop them out.
Get behind me, Satan. Okay. Dr. O'Reilly says that it's a weight-bearing structure. Okay, it is a continuation of the hoof wall, and it has its own lamellar structure. Okay, but it's not a primary weight-bearing structure in terms of load down, but it is a weight-bearing structure in terms of stability of movement, which is why it's got its own set of rigidity. Now, the thing is, you can't leave them overgrown where they fracture and break, because then they lose their function. But you can't cut them out either. So, going back to that traditional best practice, the thing was to trim them in such a way that you reorientate in their direction, i.e. to take the bend out, took away the flake and eased the solar horn between the bar and the wall, what we call the seat of corn. Okay, that cutting them out business developed later by people that didn't understand the anatomy.
Well, that's what I was trying to say about the competition back then. Usually if the English judges were involved, you had to kind of just define the bars a little bit.
Yeah.
You were really careful around the bars. Where if it was an American judge, a lot of times, these bars, if you scooped them out, they didn't, I mean, even in the judges' deals, they were scooping the damn, when they was giving demonstrations back then, you remember that? The American judges were scooping these damn bars out. But if you got, like when Crothers come over, Crothers made it a point that you kind of went around your bars and defined your bars. You didn't leave them up, but you defined them. You didn't overscoop them. Yeah.
When Steve said, leave your knife in your pocket when it comes to the sole.
Yeah.
That's okay, providing the sole's in the right place and it has exfoliated in the normal proportionality of that exfoliation.
Now everybody's doing it. All the judges are making you go around the bars and being real careful with the bars and trying to trim them to the proper height for the shoeing that you're doing. Where back in the day, you knew whenever there was an English judge telling you how to shoe and an American judge telling you how to shoe a lot of times.
The only guy I remember that was big on that, not scooping the bars out, was Madero's.
Yeah, oh yeah, Rob and Daryl, yeah, Bob. Mm-hmm.
He was like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah, Bob.
remember in the history of horseshoeing, okay, this Americanism of horseshoeing. You know, you come from a place where the only thing that was ever here was City F5, Diamond 5, number 5 kick street. Of course you had to cut the heels out, otherwise the shoe was short. But yeah, no, it's... Remember what Steve's saying there in terms of this exfoliation or trimming process, the guidelines for healthy feet. And this is the same as far as guidelines for healthy feet. When they're distorted and dysfunctional, you have to do something about it.
Simple. Thank you. It just brings out the point that it's a weight-bearing structure, and it does have the ability to bear weight. Okay? The frog, we're not completely sure now exactly what the frog does. I consider it an expansion joint because if the frog recedes down below the border, bearing border of the hoof wall, what happens is that the heels start to move inwards. It's elastic tissue, it's deformable, okay? So we know that it plays a role in shock absorbing, it assists the digital cushion, it plays a role in concussion, it aids in traction, okay? This is a weight sharing structure again, it's not a weight bearing structure, okay? When people will say, well, we're gonna put a hard bar shoe and we're gonna hold the alignment up, or the whatever, the bony structure, it doesn't work that way. But used with the hoof wall, in other words, as I'll show you in the next group of slides, that you can make the heels load sharing so it can really play a role in bearing weight in the heel area. Okay? So people don't realize too, when you have a healthy foot, you generally have a healthy lamella. Okay? So here's the distal phalanx. This is the periosteum, okay? This is the soft tissue that's covering the bone, okay? We hang lamellae on there, and then we hang our hoof caps on there. So, another interesting thing is you wonder why you have the thickness of hoof wall of the coronary band, and then you have basically with a well-kept foot, you have the same amount or thickness of hoof wall at the sole. Well, if you look at these lamellae, okay, from the electron microscope, look at the secondary lamellae there. They are producing foreign tubules. Okay, so they're adding the bulk of the hoof wall as the hoof wall travels down toward the ground. Okay, function. Here's another one of Caldwell's slides without his name on it. I'm sorry, Mark. Okay, so when we talk about the foot, one of the functions is protection. Okay, number 2, to accept weight, and number 3, to absorb concussion or dissipate the energy of impact. And I like that word a little bit better sometimes. I think Mark used a little different term for this. This is what I term viscoelastic properties of the hoof wall. Where are you going to find a group of structures with this viscoelastic, either visco or elasticity? If we look at visco means is that if you go ahead and you put weight on a structure continuously, over time, okay, the structure is going to deform. That's common sense. Now, depending on the supporting structures of the hoof capsule, we take that away or we address that deformation of the hoof capsule, okay, that hoof capsule will return. That's what it means, visco, okay? Elastic means is that you put the structure under stress, it changes shape, you take that stress off, and it goes back to its original shape. Okay? That's elasticity. So if you put those two together, think about it, pretty amazing properties of a horse's foot. Okay? Until proven wrong, we're going to use those lamellae, it's a good start, as suspending the distal phalanx within the hoof capsule. And there's been a lot of, well, the sole holds it up, or the sole wall juts, or whatever. Until we're proven wrong, this bone is suspended within the hoof capsule. And it makes good sense if you think about the absorbing capacity of the hoof capsule. Okay? So we put a little clinical evidence here. Here's a horse. Here's a horse with laminitis. This is, you can see the infolding of the coronary band there. This is the horse that is sinking. Okay? This has no functional wall that it can walk on, so the bone's going to sink down toward the ground. So here's a horse that was, and I apologize, it should have been trimmed better. This is a horse that was operated for canker. Okay? He goes ahead and he walks across a firm surface. Now, he's a little pottery. Don't take that bugger out into stones where it's going to hit his soul, but he's still functioning because if you radiograph him, everything's still in place. So the bone is being suspended by the hoof capsule. Okay, we talked about evidence-based farrier, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because this is what Mark's all about as well. I'm going to show you a short video. And biomechanics, again, we can hang our hats on this because there is so much proof or reality to this. And we can think about the equine digit, and we can think that as a mechanical system. Okay, so here's your structures that you have here. You have a bunch of movable parts, and then you have a control tower. Here is your biomechanical model. Okay, so anyway, if we take the weight and forth, in other words, the weight, and we go ahead and we, in the horse's case, the weight is going to go through the bony column, through the bone to the ground. It's going to be opposed by an equal and opposite force. Okay, no doubt about that. Okay, so if we put a horse's foot on a concrete surface, wherever that foot is in contact with that surface, there is a force. So in order to study this or apply it to farrier or use it in our daily life, we're going to add up all those forces, okay? And we're going to go ahead and, we're going to come up with a ground reaction force that we can go ahead and use and study and apply to the horse's foot. And remember, the ground reaction force is a vector. And I'm just repeating what Mark said. Tell me if I'm wrong on this. And a vector has a direction and it has a magnitude. Now, in other words, how much force. Okay? But where you take the ground reaction force, okay, where we can manipulate that and where this acts on the horse's foot is called the center of pressure or the point of force. There's a bunch of different names for it, okay? But it means this is where that force that's being opposed on the bottom acts on the horse's foot. This is the area that we can change, okay, as farrier. We change it every day when we shoe a horse, okay? So if we look at the horse's foot on a flat surface, whether it's shod or unshod, okay, you'll see that those forces go all the way around the bearing border of the horse's wall. But where we can study or apply those forces is usually this is where we add them all together, and this is the center of pressure where it acts on the horse's foot, which we can manipulate. And it's usually with the horse standing still. It's going to be just medial to the point of the point of the prod.
Just jump in just for a
Absolutely.
You just jump in just for a second.
Please.
I want to just explain how they come up with one point, okay, because it can be a little bit vague. If you think about the orientation of the hoof capsule and its angles, okay, it's in contact with the ground, you take those points, it comes up like a pyramid. Where they all meet, you drop that straight down from the centre, that's the centre of pressure, that's how it becomes one point. Okay?
See, I told you we all learned something. Okay? So now we take that horse and we take his shoes off, we put them in the deformable surface, or you put a shoe in a pad and dental and pressure material in there because you redistribute the weight across the bottom of the horse's foot. Okay? You're taking all that force from the bearing border of the hoof wall and you're distributing it across the bottom of the horse's foot, which you can see here. Okay, this is, sometimes you think about it when you put a pad on and or a spider plate or impression material or a combination, you're redistributing that load across the bottom of the horse's foot. But what's interesting there is that the center of pressure stays basically the same. So I'm going to go